Everyone, and thank you for coming along to this session. My name is Andrea O'Brien, and I've had the pleasure over the last 2 years of chairing the Speakers and Program Committee for this conference. So as you can imagine, many of us are breathing sighs of relief as things continue to develop and the days continue to go well. So this afternoon I have the pleasure of being your room host, and before we start I would like to introduce our representative from the University of Notre Dame, because as you know, the University of Notre Dame is one of our main sponsors for this conference.
Thanks very much, Andrea. Hi everybody, I will take about 1 minute of your time, even less perhaps. My name is Jessica Manty. I'm the Acting Executive Dean of the Faculty of Education, Philosophy and Theology at Notre Dame. We're really excited to be sponsors of this conference. What an amazing event. How fortunate have we been to have speakers like Professor William here today. I will tell you very briefly about a couple of things, if I may. I just have to put these things down. If you've come to our stand, you will have seen there's a number of degrees that are offered to you and different opportunities at university. One of the ones I really have been talking to people about is this one in the postgraduate document, and so I choose this one to talk about. My colleague Renee spoke about the Global Centre for Catholic Leaders earlier. This one I think is an interesting one for you because lots of people have come and said to me, I've done 2 masters, I don't know what to do next. And I say, wow, wow, is there anyone? Pretty good, hey? So my suggestion is this: a person who's done 1 master's or thinking about 1 master's in this room is already a leader in their area. So you've actually got questions yourself. So yeah, a master's is a great thing to do, Master of Education in whatever is your area. But if you have a question that you really want to get into, say it's something about assessment or something like that, you might have something that you want to research. And so you could think about a Doctor of Education or a Doctor of Philosophy. The Doctor of Education is an industry degree, an industry doctorate that allows you to respond to something that's happening in your sector, write about it, report on it, and use it for change. And we have lovely ones of those if anyone wants to come along. That's the end of that plug. Now, there's brochures around. Please have a look. If there is a post-it note on the back, I probably have a goodie here for you as well. I can't remember how many post-its there are, so let's see how we go. Thank you.
Thank you. For those people standing at the back, there are a few seats scattered around the front here. So if you happen to have a spare seat next to you, could you wave your hand in the air so people can come and take a seat? There's a couple more up here.
While people are getting in here, the Ed.D. is actually a very interesting qualification. So I was involved in the University of London's Specialist Doctorates Committee way back in the late 80s, early 90s. And I was very critical of the PhD because you know an awful lot about a very little with a PhD. You dive in to more detail. I mean, basically, you should know more about this than anybody else on the planet. I think PhD is the right grounding for somebody who wants to be a researcher. But if you want to work in education, I think the Ed.D. is a far more useful qualification because it encourages a breadth of understanding the field rather than just focusing on one narrow topic. So I always say that if you want to be a researcher, do a PhD. If you want to influence education, then do an Ed.D. It's going to be far more useful because it helps you. I know people with PhDs who decided right from the beginning, I'm going to be a qualitative researcher. Now, I think that's stupid. I think you should be a researcher first and then decide the methods once you've decided the research question. The idea you've decided to do qualitative research because numbers scare you, in my view, makes you a bad researcher. So the Ed.D. I think is useful because it makes you broaden out your horizons, introduces you to a range of research methodologies. So that's, I think, quite important. Okay, so I can't remember who came up with this title. It wasn't me, but it may be somebody on the program committee. It may be AI. Who knows these days? So anyway, I want to talk to you about expertise. What makes expertise in teaching and elsewhere? I want to spend a little bit of time on effective teacher learning. How do teachers learn? How do they get better? And I want to conclude with some thoughts about the school as a learning organization. The idea is that schools learn, and not because it's cute, not because it's nice to be a learning organization, it's because I think every school should be improving all the time. Not because you're not good enough, but because you could be even better. So what does it mean for a school to be a learning organization? We'll spend some time on that. Okay, let's start with expertise. And let's start with a research study that you've probably heard about indirectly. So, music professors at the Berlin Academy of Music were asked to identify students who had the potential to be world-class soloists on the violin. They were also asked to choose 10 people who were good, but not outstanding, and for comparison, 10 students who were training to be music teachers who specialized in the violin. And then, just as a kind of cross-reference, they also looked for 10 middle-aged violinists from local orchestras. And in each case, there were basically 7 females and 3 males, matched in age for the first 3 groups, obviously not for the last. They were then asked, how much do you practice? How much did you practice when you were younger? And so these are the graphs for the music students, the good violinists, the outstanding violinists, and the professionals. Now, it's quite hard to see the trends there, so I've drawn for you here the cumulative practice. And by the age of 20, both the best soloists and the professionals had racked up 10,000 hours of practice. Does that figure ring a bell? It's what Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Outliers, called the magic number of greatness. It's nonsense. K. Anders Ericsson said that's not a good interpretation of this research. First of all, just remember where this 10,000 hours figure comes from. These are people being asked to remember how much practice they did when they were 5. And some of these people are 45 years old. Secondly, it's an average. For some it was 15,000, for more, it was more like 8,000. It only applies to the violin and the piano, which are the 2 most competitive instruments in most music academies. For cello, it was 8,000 hours. We're not going to get into the viola jokes, but if you want a good laugh, just Google viola jokes. Some of the funniest stuff out there. Why do people take an instant dislike to the viola? It just saves time. Percussion, it was 6,000 hours. So there's a lot of things wrong with this figure. And so a lot of people got latched onto this idea of 10,000 hours, and it's just got no grounding in research. The only grounding it ever had was a misinterpretation of this one study. But here's the important point. By the age of 18, the best violinists have racked up 40% more practice than good violinists. And here's the really important point. The amount of practice that the best violinists were doing was about as much as they could do in a day. The outstanding students took more naps during the day because the practice they were doing was exhausting them. And so what's important, and this is where this phrase deliberate practice comes from. Anders Ericsson wanted to distinguish between purposeful practice and deliberate practice. And deliberate practice is pushing yourself to do the things you can't yet do. So one of the major differences they found was that the good students practiced by playing the things they could already play. The outstanding students practiced the things they could not yet play. And that's not fun. Hence the old line, if you're enjoying your violin practice, you're not doing it right. It's instrumental in achieving. I think it was Yasha Heifetz who said, if I don't practice for a day, I notice. If I don't practice for 2 days, my wife notices. If I don't practice for 3 days, everyone notices. It's that discipline, and it's an extraordinary thing. So I don't know if you've ever listened to the music of King Crimson, but the leader of King Crimson, Robert Fripp, is just this extraordinary person who's devoted like 50 years to just becoming outstanding at one instrument and just pushing himself all the time and writing pieces that make him practice. So there's one piece that he called Fracture, and he deliberately wrote it because it made him practice, because he couldn't play it unless he practiced it all the time. Alan Holdsworth, another guitarist, my favorite probably guitarist, says he can't bear to listen to anything that he recorded more than 2 years ago because he's moved on so much. So it's that kind of dedication. So, since the amount of deliberate practice being undertaken by the best students is close to the maximum possible, the other students just can't catch up. That's the important insight. So, here's what Anders Ericsson says. Elite performance is the result of at least a decade of maximal efforts. So 10,000 hours doesn't have much grounding, 10 years does. The earliest reference to 10 years of deliberate practice we can find is in becoming a cuneiform scribe in ancient Babylon. So it took 10 years to become an expert cuneiform scribe because of the ambiguity about some of the characters. A study in 1899 looked at wireless telegraph operators, and they discovered that, it took 10 years to become an expert wireless telegraph operator. Not sure whether it's coincidence or not, but in the medieval periods, stonemasons took roughly 10 years to become a fully fledged stonemason. It might have been because those days it took it so much time to earn the money to buy the tools. I can't be sure about that. But that figure of 10 years keeps on coming up. So what distinguishes experts from others is just that commitment to deliberate practice. And it's neither motivating nor enjoyable. It's just because you want to get better at something. So that's really quite important. So there's a big debate in psychology. On one side, you've got Anders Ericsson saying that expertise is all about practice. On the other side, you've got David Hambrick saying, well, no, there's also a talent issue. So what's really hard is this. You do find that the people who are very good have done lots of practice. But the question is, do you need a certain amount of talent to benefit from the practice? In other words, who racks up 10,000 hours or 10 years of practice? It's the ones who think they're getting better. And so you may need a certain amount of talent to get better enough for the practice to be worthwhile. So Malcolm Gladwell talks about talent being overrated, but he gets a lot of the details wrong. Look, I read everything he writes, but so much of it is wrong. So one of his studies is about the Beatles. And you probably heard about, in the late 1950s, early 60s, most pop bands were getting 2 or 3 40-minute gigs a week. Because the Beatles were a bit better than those other bands, they got a residency at a nightclub in Hamburg, where they ended up playing for 8 hours every night. And Gladwell's claim is it was the 8 hours of practice every night that made them world class. What people forget is Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. Have you heard of them? No, nobody has. So this nightclub, strip club actually, in Hamburg, had 2 pop venues at either ends of the nightclub. And the Beatles and Rory Storm and the Hurricanes alternated every night. And so Rory Storm and the Hurricanes also got 8 hours of practice every night. But you know what? They just weren't as talented. So I think we have to be very careful in sort of overgeneralizing from those kinds of studies. Practice is definitely important. Matthew Syed, who was British table tennis champion, talks about his, he happened to be in a village where there was a village hall where there was a table tennis table and the kids were allowed to use it all the time. So he just got better by having loads of practice. But I think he also was pretty talented. There's a wonderful bit in the book, actually, where he describes playing tennis against Michael Stich. I don't know if you remember him from the 80s and 90s, but he was the first person, I think, to serve at over 120 miles an hour. And so Matthew Syed talks about facing him. And you might not have the shots, but at least a table tennis player should have the reactions. The first time Michael Stich served, Matthew Syed says he didn't even see the ball. It's like in cricket. If you have to wait until you see the ball, it's too late. And so we actually know that, for example, Viv Richards had amazing eyesight. He was known for it as a kid. In the average Major League Baseball player, the batter, has 20/11 vision. They can see at 20 feet where the average person can only see at 11 feet. So it doesn't matter how good you are, how much you care about this, if you don't have those magic eyeballs, you're never going to be a major league batter. So, we have to be careful about talent versus experience. But there's also this idea of talent is overrated. And, there's something in that argument. Okay, so expertise is specific. Matthew Syed's story of basically playing tennis as a world-class table tennis player against tennis player, not very effective. World-class chess players aren't any better than average at playing drafts. Golden drafts here or checkers? Checkers. Drafts, okay. Yes. It's how American is Australia becoming? I'm just not sure. Is only weakly related to general ability. So people with higher IQs do make better chess players to begin with. But after a couple of years, it's just experience. Experts can't tell you what they do. It's not reducible to propositional knowledge. It involves automation of basic routines, involves perceiving meaningful patterns, and involves differently organized rather than more knowledge. So this is true of expertise generally. Let's just apply that to education, to teaching. Expertise is specific and limited. Actually, that's true. We know that people who are great at teaching year 7 maths are usually, unless they've had special training, not very good at teaching year 7 maths to students with special needs. It's amazing how specific it is. There's a wonderful video of Jenny Finch. I don't know if you've heard about Jenny Finch. She's an American softball pitcher. So I don't know if you know, for some reason, girls aren't allowed to play baseball in America. So they have to play softball, and the ball is much bigger. And they're not allowed to throw overarm because somehow it's unladylike. So they throw underarm, okay? So Jenny Finch is probably one of the best pitchers of all time. And so they've got this amazing action where she goes like this, and she just throws the ball underarm. And you've got her throwing to Albert Pujols, one of the best batters of all time. And so he's used to hitting a 100-mile-an-hour fastball. Jenny Finch is pitching at 60 miles an hour, and he didn't manage to put a bat on the ball because it's just so different. He didn't know what to look for because it's the angle of the arm, it's all those other things that when cricketers are playing spin, it's all those things that you know to look for. If you wait until you see the ball, it's too late. Weakly rated, smarter people don't make better teachers. It'd be great if they did, but we don't know that. Expert teachers can't tell you what they do. They just do it. You don't realize how expert teachers are until you see novices, because novices are useless at so many things, like getting the children in the room. The expert just waves their arms and some other children are inside, and with the novice, it's like herding cats. Isn't it? The children. We've discovered that it takes novice teachers 4 hours to plan 1 hour student learning. Expert teachers do it better in 5 minutes. How? Practice, repetition. David Berliner did some very interesting research on teacher expertise, where he showed people videos of a classroom setting, actually with multiple TV screens, because this is back in the 1990s where they didn't have digital technology. And what was interesting was that when you asked teachers, expert teachers, what was happening, they always went to the core. This looks like something towards the end of a lesson. They're packing up after some practicals. Novice teachers just couldn't see anything. They were just focusing on the surface features. And I learned that the hard way. I've only ever once taken on as a PhD student somebody who'd never been a teacher. Because the standard model in most disciplines is you take people straight from their undergraduate degree. And I used to work with people who were already teaching. And I had one student who had never been a teacher. And I got into trouble because it took her 6 years to finish the thesis, and we were penalized for not actually completing in 4. It took her 3 years to make sense of classrooms. And I hadn't realized how much knowledge that experts, that even ordinary teachers have about what is going on in the classroom, what you see. They just couldn't see it. She just couldn't see it at all because she hadn't been in classrooms long enough. It's just, you don't realize what knowledge you bring to that situation. And it's just this idea of differently organized rather than more knowledge. Okay, so the research, as far as we know, suggests that expertise in teaching shares those characteristics. Here's the important point. For teaching not to be like those other subjects where expertise has been studied, like acting, scuba diving, X-ray radiography, chess. Those things would all have to be the same and different from teaching, and I don't think that's true. So basically, I think that as far as we know, what applies to the other fields that have been studied in the expertise research applies to teaching. That's my claim. So as far as we can tell, I think the general research on expertise seems to be a good guide to what would be expert in teaching as well. So let's look at the evidence. Do teachers get better? Of course they do. You have to. I mean, basically, you have to get better just to survive. And the evidence is that teachers become much more productive, particularly early on. So these are 4 different models of teachers teaching mathematics. The vertical axis is extra months per year of learning, and the really rapid improvement comes in the first year. But, then some studies came along and said, teachers basically reach as good as they're going to get after 3 to 5 years. I think that's wrong. So English, the effects seem to be a bit smaller. But here's what's really interesting. These are teachers who started out in the bottom 20%, next 20%, next 20%, next 20%, top 20%. So what's interesting is that the teachers who start out good don't improve. They're coasting. They've never had to work very hard. Those are the charismatic ones. So most of the improvement that we see on average amongst teachers seems to be driven by the teachers who actually need to get better. And so that also suggests that those teachers, that the best teachers are not getting better, they're not doing deliberate practice. So that's why I think getting smarter people into teaching, which governments often like to say, we need education to be the toughest subject to get into, it's not going to make a difference. All teachers slow, and many teachers actually stop improving. So that suggests that we're only beginning to scratch the surface of what we're capable of. I think we need people to be coming into teaching who want to get better as teachers. So I used to run a teacher training course. I would ask everybody who I interviewed, why do you want to be a teacher? And I knew I had problems when somebody says, well, I love maths or physics and I want to pass on that enjoyment to others. Do you know why I had problems? Because they only liked teaching the students who were good at that subject. The only good example is, I like working with young people. I happen to be an English teacher, but that's just the vehicle. I want to work with young people. I want to help them improve. And so that's why we need people to say, in the teaching job, who say, I want to get better and better and better. I want this job because it's difficult, because one lifetime isn't enough to master it. I want a challenge. That's why I think there's no limit to what we can achieve if we just support teachers in the right way. So here's my question for you. Given support and encouragement, what proportion of the teachers in your school could be as good as, say, the best 10%, given 10 years of deliberate practice? And I'm going to ask you to vote for one of those percentages in 2 minutes' time. So I'm going to ask you to talk to each other, to bring the group back together again. Rather than shouting over you, I'll just raise my hand. When you see me raise my hand, I'd like you to do 2 things. One easy, one hard. Easy one, raise your own hand. Hard one, stop talking. Okay? Let's take a minute to discuss what proportion of teachers could we get to be as good as the very best. Okay, thank you. I'd like to find out what you think now by using a digital voting system. I'd like you to hold up 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 digits. According to you, we think the answer is A, B, C, D, or E. By the way, I have no idea what the correct answer is, so you can't be wrong. I'm just curious about what you think. What proportion of our teachers could we make into what are currently only the best 10%, given 10 years of deliberate practice? Just vote, just to show that. Okay. Some fairly skeptical, 30%. Okay. Many of you, I'd say the majority are sort of 70 or even 90%. We don't know, but here's what I want to do. I want anybody who doesn't want to do that deliberate practice out. For 2 reasons. One, they're displacing somebody who might be a lot better, but more importantly, they will always be a corrosive influence on your attempts to improve the school. I'm good enough. I get great results. Yeah, you get great results because kids who don't like your subject don't choose it. So, So there's nothing more corrosive than those who undermine the school's efforts for everybody to get better. So I don't know, but my hunch is it could be 70%. It may even be 90%. But here's the problem. What does deliberate practice look like in teaching? So the problem, and education is really great for latching onto deep ideas and using them in a trivial sense. So we have lots of teachers talking about the zone of proximal development. Yeah, you know this comes from Vygotsky. You know it's nonsense, don't you? So Vygotsky distinguished between learning and development. Like Piaget, he believed in stages of development. And for him, learning is what happens within a stage. Development is what triggers the movement to the next stage. And that's why he said the only good teaching is that which is in advance of development, because he was trying to get people to move to the next level. He wasn't interested in teaching any content. So, first of all, we are, I think, interested in teaching content. More importantly, psychologists haven't discovered a distinction between learning and development. So anybody who says this is developmentally inappropriate for a kid doesn't know what they're talking about, because there's no such thing. They just lack the prerequisites. And so the zone of proximal development is really the zone of proximal learning, i.e. teach students stuff they don't know yet. Hardly a deep insight. So we're always making things sound more complicated. People talk about adaptive expertise. Well, I think it's stupid, because expertise is always adaptive. Experts can adapt to a new situation. And deliberate practice. Deliberate practice involves practice plus feedback. So here's the problem in teaching. We don't know what makes a good teacher. So actually, we can't give good feedback. We don't know that the feedback we're going to give is going to make people better, because we have very weak measures of what it means to be a good teacher. So I don't know whether we can actually ever get to deliberate practice, because our models of what makes good teaching are so impoverished. But I think it's worthwhile as a goal. So let's look at what makes effective teacher learning. And I think there are 2 problems that I thought were actually one problem, but now I think they're 2 separate problems. And they are the knowing more than we can say and the knowing-doing gap. So let's start with the knowing more than we can say. So Gary and Helen Klein did a little experiment where they prepared 6 different video clips of people performing CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation. 5 of the videos were students learning how to do CPR, and 1 was an expert paramedic who'd been doing this for 20 years. But all the people in the videos were in their 40s, so you couldn't tell who the expert was just by looking at the oldest looking person. So people were shown these clips, and they were asked, which one of these 6 people, A, B, C, D, E, or F, which one of these 6 would you want doing CPR on you if you needed it? The experts picked the expert 90% of the time. The students picked the expert 50% of the time. The instructors, the people who teach other people how to do CPR, pick the expert 30% of the time. Why? Any thoughts? Sorry? Partly. Well, it wasn't they were critiquing. The point is that they couldn't see the separate steps that they were used to teaching in the work of experts. There was a fluidity about the work of experts where those separate stages weren't visible, but they were visible to experts. So even though the work of an expert paramedic could not be reduced to those separate stages, experts could spot other experts. So this is something we see all the time, and this is, Frederick Bartlett's astute observation back in the 1930s, knowing more than we can say. We can't actually put what we can do into words. And this is where I think we've gotten really wrong with teacher coaching. Because you see, we tend to think that teacher expertise is like the knowledge of how to solve an equation. It's more like the knowledge of how to ride a bike. I can explain to you how to solve an equation. I can't explain to you how to ride a bicycle. And because we over-academicize teaching, we've tried to look for kind of principles and try to reduce it to declarative knowledge. And I think the problem started when we moved teacher training out of the teacher training colleges and into the universities. Ken Robinson used to joke that for academics, bodies are just things for moving your brains around with. And I think that, we used to, when it was done in the teacher training colleges, we did things like voice coaching. Looking after your voice. Also, just your positioning in the classroom. A number of novice teachers who sort of sit down to explain something with a kid, sticking their backside out to the rest of the classroom. And, the expert teacher's always sort of like this, and it's just that, teaching is a physical, embodied act, and it's not reducible to those kinds of prescriptions that we like to have in academe. So I think that's the real problem, is that we've mistaken the nature of teacher knowledge. We know more than we can say. Improving practice, of changing habits, not adding knowledge. And the hardest bit is not getting new ideas into people's heads, it's getting the old ones out, and it takes time. And it doesn't happen naturally. Andrew Lee in Queensland found that the natural teacher is better on their first day than the average teacher will be after 10 years in the classroom. So, this is the big issue. Are teachers born or made? Well, right now they're born because we're not very good at making them. But we could get better at making them as well. We could actually work on that. So the real issue here is changing habits, and this is what Jeffrey Pfeffer calls the knowing-doing gap. So he's a management professor at Stanford University. He consults with organizations, trying to help them improve their productivity, and he asks them, do you do this? Should you do this? Rated on a 6-point scale. And in all the companies that he's worked with, that we know we should do this score is higher than the we do this score. The research in America shows that most businesses that go bust don't go bust because they had the wrong plans. They had the right plans, they just didn't execute them properly. So it's actually just doing what you should be doing, the knowing-doing gap. It's really quite a challenge. Sometimes it's a combination of knowing, of habit change and knowledge. So I don't know if you've heard of Ignaz Semmelweis. Has anybody heard of Ignaz Semmelweis? A few of you? Okay. So he worked at the Vienna General Hospital, and he was interested and concerned by deaths from what was called puerperal fever. This is classic doctor speak. So puerperal fever, also called childbed fever, it's just an illness that affected women giving birth. So it's a typical doctor thing. Give it a name, doesn't explain anything. It's just, it's women in childbirth. And the base rate at Dublin Maternity Hospital was about 1.5%, 2%, which was true for the Vienna General Hospital where he worked until the early 1820s, when it shot up. Why? Because of the introduction of pathological anatomy. Doctors, waiting for women to give birth, were going to an anatomy lecture theatre and cutting up corpses and coming back then to assist with the birth. And they weren't washing their hands because, as they said at the time, gentlemen have clean hands. And so, for many years, Semmelweis And don't forget, the germ theory of disease did not exist at this time. So nobody knew what was causing this, but he suggested that the doctors should wash their hands in a mild chlorine solution. And that's what happened in 1848, and deaths from puerperal fever collapsed. But it was just this resistance to, well, we know what we're doing, and the difficulty of habit change. So now, of course, we know how important it is to wash hands. Do you think it's important to wash hands before going into, oh, I don't know, a neonatal intensive care unit? I like to think that doctors would prioritize that, which makes it all the more worrying that one study found the compliance rate with hand hygiene protocols was 29%. I guarantee that not one of those doctors thinks it's a bad idea. But the point is that Atul Gawande, a surgeon at the Boston General Hospital, points out that if they follow the protocols, doctors would spend 50% of their working hours washing their hands, which is A, a huge opportunity cost, and B, causes real problems with skin rashes. So but it's really hard to change habits. It's the knowing doing gap all over again. So fortunately, we now have some pretty good research on habit change. So Chip and Dan Heath wrote a book called Switch. Very easy to read, very well written. And what they do is they take all the research on habit change and kind of present it in terms of 9 strategies for change, which they group into 3 categories. So they use a metaphor from, I think it's Phaedrus, the idea that in each of our heads, there's these 2 forces. There's the rational and the emotional side. And so you've got the rider is the rational side, the motivational element is the strong side, and then shaping the path, the idea that, so let's imagine the mahout on the back of the elephant's neck, the rider, the elephant. The mahout thinks he's in charge, but of course the elephant is much stronger than the mahout and he won't go anywhere the elephant doesn't want to go. But even the elephant can't walk through buildings, so the environment still influences what the elephant can do. So, Jerry and Monique Sternin at one point worked for Save the Children in Vietnam. They were posted out to this remote village where there was a real problem with malnutrition. And obviously they couldn't do anything about the typical things like sanitation or decent food. They noticed that some of the babies didn't have malnutrition, and they looked at the mothers and asked them what they were doing differently. It turned out these mothers were feeding their babies twice a day rather than the traditional once a day. And they were supplementing the children's diet, which was mainly rice, with some freshwater shrimp and some greens they were finding in the forest. So they invited the mothers to run cookery classes for the other mothers, where the price of admission was bringing along some greens and some freshwater shrimp. They were then posted to a different village, but a year later, some evaluators came back and malnutrition had been eradicated. Not by coming up with some solution from outside, but finding what was working locally and scaling that up. So that's the first thing, is follow the bright spots. Find what's working locally and scale that up. I think Weight Watchers changed their policies recently, but they used to make things easy for people. 25 points. Not eat more sensibly, but 25 points. There was a campaign in West Virginia to address childhood obesity. And ultimately, they realized that the easiest way to address this is to change what's in the refrigerator. So they just said, just buy 1% milk. If you want people to do stuff, don't make it hard for them to do it. And then point to the destinations. At one time, Ian Vann was head of exploration for British Petroleum, BP now. And he had a real challenge. This is in 1980. It was costing BP $5 a barrel to find oil. And their competitors, particularly those in Saudi Arabia, were finding oil for $1 a barrel. BP was hitting oil 20% of the time they drilled. So to get their costs down to $1 a barrel, he realized that the only way to do this was to have no dry holes. So he announced this as what Jim Collins calls a big, hairy, audacious goal. No dry holes. And people said, that's stupid. There's no way you can have no dry holes. The science isn't just developed enough. But he said, that's the goal. And what happened was the internal culture of the organization changed. Nobody wanted to be the first person that month to drill a dry hole. They resisted pressure from local agencies to drill just because they wanted to be seen to be doing something. And over the next 10 years, BP's success rate went up from 20% to 80%. They didn't reach the goal, but they made far more progress by breaking that mindset, by saying, no, a big, hairy, audacious goal. The second set of three concerns the emotional side of habit change rather than the rational side. So John Stegner used to be head of procurement for the Delphi automotive chain in the United States. They had 23 factories that make parts for cars in America. And one summer, he got a summer intern to do a little project, find out how many different kinds of protective glove we are buying across the 23 factories. The intern discovered, by going through the invoices, they were buying 424 different kinds of glove for the people who worked in these factories. And they were paying incredibly varied prices. Some were paying $10 and some paying $20 for the same gloves. And he'd raised this several times, nothing had happened. So one day, he snuck into the boardroom before a board meeting and piled 424 pairs of gloves on the boardroom table, each one tagged with which factory had bought it and how much they'd paid. So the vice presidents come into this board meeting expecting to see a table with some papers and some carafes of water, and there's this mountain of gloves. And they're walking around, we paid that much? That day, they got some action. But it wasn't the rational appeal to value for money, it was the emotional appeal of 424 pairs of gloves on the boardroom table. Sometimes you have to actually engage that emotional side. Shrink the change. So I retired from university life 15 years ago. I joke that I left university to focus on teaching and research because I found that universities weren't that great for doing that anymore. But I had a problem. Over a 30-year career as an academic, I had accumulated 4 filing cabinets full of photocopied chapters and papers. I worked out, there's about 10,000 documents. I worked out if I'd piled them high, it would be 10 meters high. And I realized I had to scan 10,000 documents. I couldn't face it. So I set myself a different target. 1 centimeter of paper a day. So every day I was in my home office, I had to scan 1 centimeter of paper. And 3.5 years later, the job was done. I now have backups on several continents, in case you're worried. I couldn't face scanning 10 meters of paper. I could face scanning 1 centimeter of paper a day. So if you've got teenagers and you want them to get them to tidy up their bedrooms, don't say tidy up your bedroom. To a teenager, that feels like a Herculean task, compared to which the cleaning of the Augean stables is positively trivial. Ask them, just do a 5-minute makeover. Just pick up your room for 5 minutes, and when the buzzer goes for 5 minutes, for today you're done. Shrink the change, make it feel achievable. And then grow your people, this idea of a growth mindset, the idea that everybody needs to get better, not because they're not good enough, because you can get even better. The last 3 are about shaping the environment to support habit change. So, tweak the environment. Amazon gets this. Before the advent of one-click ordering, you want to buy a book, you go into Amazon, you choose the book, you go to the cart, you check out, you type in the credit card number, you type in the expiration date, you type in the CVV code, you press buy, go make a cup of coffee. Find out that the transaction didn't go through because you forgot to check the box that says, I accept the terms and conditions. You check that box, press buy again, go get another cup of coffee, find out that a transaction didn't go through because the refresh of the page wiped out the 3-digit CVV code, by which time you put the credit card away and you think, sorry, I didn't want the book anyway. So Amazon was losing sales because they made it too hard for you to do what they wanted you to do and you wanted to do. Hence one-click ordering. Don't make it hard for people to do the things you want them to do. The environment's also important. Brian Wansink did some research on people's eating habits. So, more recently, some of his studies have been discredited, but I think this one holds up. So he took over a Chicago movie theater for the 1989 premiere of Mel Gibson's film Payback. They chose the 1 p.m. showing so that people would probably have eaten lunch, they wouldn't be that hungry. People were invited in, and they were asked to help out in a kind of evaluation. The cover story was they were evaluating the concessions, so they were offered a free tub of popcorn if they agreed to fill in a questionnaire about the popcorn at the end of the movie. People came in, were offered these free tubs of popcorn. There were two things they didn't know. One of them was the tubs looked identical, but contained different amounts of popcorn. Half of the tubs had false floors and contained 100 grams of popcorn. The others had 200 grams of popcorn. The other thing they didn't know, the popcorn had been prepared a week earlier and kept under sterile conditions to be really unpleasant to eat. One person later described it as like eating styrofoam packing peanuts. So people came out of the movie, handed over the tubs of popcorn, filled in the questionnaire. The researchers then weighed the tubs of popcorn. The people who'd been given 100 grams ate 50 grams of this popcorn. The people who'd been given 200 grams ate 75 grams. They ate 50% more of this horrible popcorn because they'd been given more in the tub. This is the logic of choosing smaller plates when you're trying to diet. Just, but don't make them too small because otherwise you think 2 plates are okay. So it's quite a difficult balance to get right. Don't tax the rider, and building these action triggers. So a couple of examples. So when I advise young academics now, I say to them, before you send an article off to a journal, decide what you're going to do if it's rejected. Because getting rejection is painful, especially for a young researcher who knows that their promotion is going to depend on getting lots of publications. So think about plan B before you execute plan A. It makes, okay, fine, they didn't want it, on to plan B. Barack Obama uses kind of action trigger in his election campaign. So, campaigners call up, are you registered to vote? Yes. Are you going to vote for our candidate? Yes. Don't forget to vote. Half the phone calls had 2 extra questions. Where will you be coming from when you go to vote? And what will you have been doing? The people who had those extra 2 questions were 11 percentage points more likely to actually vote on the day because they'd been actually given that action trigger, that been thinking through the process of voting. And finally, rally the herd. So Becky Richards used to be director of academic services at the Kaiser Permanente chain of hospitals in Northern California. And they had a real problem with what are called medication errors. So in hospitals, they give people medications, sometimes got the wrong medication, sometimes got the wrong dose, the wrong time. No deaths, but several near misses. So she decided to find out what was going wrong. And what she found out that nurses doing the medication rounds were constantly being disturbed in the process of dispensing these medications. Often for very good reasons. There's a code, somebody needs help. A doctor passing through wants to check on a patient. But nurses were constantly being stopped from doing their main job. So they decided to build what they call free spaces in hospitals. So when a nurse is doing a medication round, he or she has to wheel the medication cart into a special area, which is marked out on the floor in red. They have to don a special high visibility vest in day glow neon yellow with medication round do not disturb written on the back. And the nurses hated it. They thought it was demeaning, suggesting they couldn't do their job. The vests were hard to get on and off. They were hard to keep clean. They were on the point of rebelling when the data came in. Medication errors had dropped by over 60%, simply by giving these nurses the time to do their job properly. Because it's important, because often doctors prescribe dosages in terms of milligrams or micrograms per kilo of patient body mass. And you know what kind of errors people make then? It's decimal point errors. It's 10 times too little or 10 times too much. But just giving the nurses the time to do their job properly reduced medication errors by 60%. So Applying that to teacher learning, I think we can actually use a lot of this. So it came up this morning, I think, in the panel, but I think I'd start with volunteers rather than conscripts. Start with the bright spots. Start off with the people who want to make this work. There'll always be people saying, this won't work in maths. Yeah. But if there's somebody doing it in the classroom next door, it's harder for them to say that. So find the teachers who are willing to make this work, to beat down the problems. Script the critical moves. Left to their own devices, we think teachers will chat forever. That's why I'm very critical of things like critical friendship groups and coaching tries. There's no structure. There's no kind of agenda that they have to follow. So script the critical moves. Point to the destination. So in America, we have a piece of legislation called, what it used to be called the No Child Left Behind. But what a stupid title. No Child Left Behind. Can you imagine the pressure on the last kid? It's your fault we didn't make it. But now I think it's a reasonable goal. It's a big, hairy, audacious goal. I think No Child Left Behind is more of a rallying cry than, not too many children left behind, please. Find the feeling. I don't know of a single teacher who became a teacher to increase NAPLAN scores. They became a teacher to make a difference in children's lives, so reconnecting teachers with that moral imperative, and then allowing every teacher to take small steps. Don't ask them to throw away what they've been doing for 20 years, just ask them to make small steps. And then this idea of growth mindset for teachers. I think we've applied it too narrowly. I think growth mindset is for everybody, including teachers. Because you see, if you don't think you can be better as a teacher, when you fail, and you will fail because the job is impossible, because not every kid is going to get every idea, if you have a fixed mindset as a teacher, you'll be that cynical teacher who blames the kids. What can you expect from kids from that part of town with those kinds of parents? The teacher with a growth mindset says, what else can I try? And then building time for teacher learning, creating routines and structures, and this idea from Esther Dyson, make new mistakes. There's no excuse for making the same mistake over and over again. But there's no excuse for making no mistakes at all. As Mario Andretti, the racing driver, used to say, if everything seems under control, you're not going fast enough. That's why I like this idea of always make new mistakes. So these are the ideas that have driven our approach towards designing effective teacher learning where habit change is concerned. And I think that that's important. You know, sometimes teachers need to know stuff, but that's really quite limited. So do you know the research on wait time? How long do teachers on average wait after asking a question before giving a hint? Just indicate with a number of fingers how many seconds you think it is. What's the average teacher wait time? Yeah, the classic study by Mary Budd Rowe has an average figure of 0.9 seconds. So lower secondary school science classrooms. Now, here's the interesting point. Reminding teachers of that research has about as much impact on their practice as reminding smokers of the harmful effects of smoking. It's not a knowledge problem. It's a habit change problem. And the trouble is we keep on thinking about all these things as knowledge problems, and then most of the time they're not. They're habit change problems. And we think of these habits as being negative. Habits are what get teachers through the day. I mean, your first year of teaching, everything was hard. And, you know, basically just getting the things correctly spelled on the blackboard is hard enough. Worrying about the inclusion of kids in the far left corner is way down the list of your priorities. So habits are teachers' basic assets, but they're also their greatest liability. One teacher described changing habits while still teaching as in-flight engine repair. It's hard. We must recognize and value those habits, but also recognize they need to be changed. So just take a moment now to reflect on this. Does this make sense as a kind of set of strategies? Do you think this would this help you design? Would this help you improve teacher training, teacher professional development in areas where habit change you think is crucial? Obviously, if there's knowledge that needs to be dispensed, then, you know, as Zach Groeschel says, just tell them, you know, just teach it to them. But in most of the areas I think that are important for teachers, it's not like that. It's actually habit change. So just take a moment to discuss this. Does this seem like a sensible framework for your own work? Thank you. So from the keynote this morning, you will know that I'm very passionate about the idea that teachers should be working on the stuff that makes the biggest difference to their students. So I'm actually quite critical of things like coaching triads and critical friendship groups and these generic models, because it doesn't guarantee that teachers work on the right stuff. So I describe this model as content, then process. First, figure out what you want teachers to change about their practice, and then, and only then, figure out how to best do that. So I've shared with you the evidence about formative assessment. In my workshop tomorrow, I'm going to talk about the strategies and techniques, but you know most of these already. What I suggest is that 5 things need to be in place to maximize the chances of success. They are choice, flexibility, small steps, accountability, and support. So, choice. Why is choice important? Well, I think talent development requires attending to both strengths and weaknesses. And for novices, we probably need to work on the weaknesses. But as I said this morning, the aim of professional development is not to make every teacher into a clone of every other teacher. It is to help each teacher become the best teacher they can be. And I think the idea that the same thing can work for an art teacher, a maths teacher, and a PE teacher is just crazy. So the idea is that we actually have a framework that allows teachers to choose which aspects of their practice to develop. This builds on the work of Douglas McGregor, who pointed out that there are basically 2 theories of management. One is, he called Theory X, to avoid any kind of pejorative implication for either. People can't be trusted, they need to be managed consistently. Theory Y is people want to do a good job. And the job of managers is to support and lead. So, Theory X isn't always wrong, and Theory Y isn't always right. But I suggest that Theory Y is always a better place to start the conversation. They discovered this in Ford Motor Company. They were trying to manage people's outcomes, these job objectives, and it wasn't working because people were able to negotiate objectives that looked challenging but were dead easy to achieve. Do you know what they discovered had the biggest impact? Asking everybody, just do your best. Just imagine, in a car maker, the best way to motivate people is just do your best. If that's true for a car maker, how much more true would it be for an educational institution where most of those people are so invested in the outcome of their kids? Flexibility. Teachers need to adapt things. I've now come to the conclusion that no educational innovation can be implemented in typical classrooms in the way envisaged by its inventor. This is why teachers need to be involved in the research, because only teachers can figure out how to change things so they work in their classroom without what Ed Hartle calls lethal mutations. So when I was starting out with formative assessment, I was talking about, ice pop sticks with kids' names on. Teachers weren't replacing the sticks. So now the kid knows, once you've answered a question, you're off the hook for the next 29 questions. Why did that happen? Because we didn't explain to teachers why they were doing this. Basically, teachers need to understand what they're doing so they can make smart adaptations rather than lethal mutations. So flexibility is really important. Small steps. I was working with a teacher, year 5 teacher. She's trying to use no hands up, using cold call. She was almost in tears in frustration. She said, every time I ask a question, I always say, does anyone or has anyone? She said, why am I finding it so difficult to change? We sat down and figured out she's been teaching 23 years. I reckon that by now in her classroom, she has asked well over 500,000 questions. When you have done something a particular way 500,000 times, you'll be pretty good at it, and doing it a different way is going to be hard. So it's about recognizing the fact that teachers' expertise, as I said earlier, gets you through the day, but it makes change hard. So small steps. But it's also about becoming more aware. So I don't know if you noticed this, but when you're not looking to buy a house, you never notice estate agent signs. And when you're looking to buy a house, they're everywhere. So, if you've seen this before, who's seen this video before? So, okay, enough of you haven't. So if you've seen it before, keep quiet. If you haven't seen it before, your task is to count the number of times the players wearing white pass the ball, okay? But you'll need to concentrate, because if you look away even for half a second, you'll lose track. So how many times do the players wearing white pass the ball? What's the answer? So, depends how you count that last pass, because the last pass was passed but not received, so it says 17 or 18. Anything else? So, okay, be honest. Who didn't see the gorilla? Because I didn't see it first time. Who didn't see the gorilla? So, the point is that because you're focusing on the ball, you didn't see the gorilla, because actually when you see something, you think you're seeing everything that you're seeing, but in fact, your focus of attention is very narrow, and your brain is filling in all the other details, which you don't see. And this is why expert teachers seem to have eyes in the back of their heads, and novice teachers don't see anything. It's just because they don't have the bandwidth. But I will give you another chance. Okay, so here we go again. Of course you got that right. And you spotted the gorilla. There she goes. And the curtain is changing from yellow to orange to gold. to red. And so it takes time to see what's in front of you, because you see what you expect to see. And then try one more thing. So put one hand fully extended, look at the back of your hand, and the other hand about halfway. Try to get them both roughly in focus. Now, by the laws of physics, that nearer hand should appear 4 times the area of the further hand. Any physics teachers here willing to confirm that is the correct? It's the inverse square law. Is that how it looks? No. They seem the same size. What's going on? There's no doubt that the size of the retinal image of that nearer hand is 4 times the area of the further hand. That message is going up the optic nerves to the brain, and the brain is saying, sod that, I've had these two quite a while. They're the same size. Your brain is completely overriding the sense data that it's receiving from the optic nerve because it thinks it knows better. And that's why changing as a teacher is so hard, because you're trying to change those ways of perceiving the classroom. And the fact is, our perceptual bandwidth is tiny. So basically, we're aware of about 40 bits of information of the 10 million or so that comes in through the eyes, 30 of the ears. Can you feel your feet on the floor? You can now, but you couldn't 10 seconds ago. Can you feel your backside on the chair? Well, you can now, but you can't feel the feet on the floor anymore. So the point is that we have to learn to attend to new things to get better. That's why small steps are important. Then you have accountability. And I've mentioned this already. There's unintelligent accountability, poverty, home environment, students' prior achievement. You're not responsible for those things. Intelligent accountability is holding teachers to account for the things they can change, which is A, getting better, and B, supporting colleagues in getting better. I think teachers entirely discharge their duty of accountability to others by committing to improve their practice on things that matter to students and then supporting their colleagues in doing the same. So this is the kind of action plan, and this is very familiar, but it's just, this is the point I was making in the keynote. We also make teachers identify what you're going to do less of or stop doing to create space, and they're going to find that hard. And then finally, support, which is really just the other side of the coin from accountability. So we call this supportive accountability. So I want from every single teacher in every Catholic school in Queensland, indeed nationally, I'm going to get better for the rest of my career until I retire or die. That's basically the deal. And I'm going to focus on the things that make a difference to my students. So no more brain gym, no more learning styles. It's self-indulgent to get better at the things that don't help your students when there's evidence about what doesn't. What leaders need to do then is to commit to create that environment for teachers. Continually improving practice. I think it should be the most natural thing in the world for a school leader to say to a teacher, what are you getting better at right now? And how can I help? I got that idea from being a Pro-Vice Chancellor. You know, I don't know if you know this, but when you're a Pro-Vice Chancellor, you line manage people who do work you do not understand. One of the problems with principals in education is most of them think their schools would be great if they could merely clone themselves. You know, if I could fill my classroom, my school with people like me, it'd be a great school. You don't really become a manager until you manage people who do stuff you can't do. And so I had a very simple approach. What do you plan to do over the next 6 months? What's your plans for the next 6 months? What evidence are you going to bring me that that plan was successful? And how can I help? And that, I think, would work very well for teachers as well. What are you going to get better at? I mean, I think for novice teachers, maybe the first 3 years, they need a more directed environment. But as soon as a teacher is probably in their 3rd year of teaching, 4th year of teaching, they should be able to identify for themselves their own professional learning goals and work towards that. The other point, of course, is it encourages teachers to bring evidence to that conversation rather than just saying, I got better because I just feel it. I just know it in my bones. Well, no, sorry. This is Casey Middle School in Boulder, Colorado. And every teacher, pretty much every teacher, I think, in the school has chosen to post up what they're trying to get better at. So the idea is that if you're a visitor to the school and you have some spare time, I would really welcome any feedback you could give me and my class about what we're trying to get better at. Some of these are more about the kids than the teacher, but I think most of them are pretty impressive in terms of the teacher's openness to, yes, I'm trying to get better, and am I doing it right? Am I delivering on the things I say I'm trying to get better at? Keeping the focus on the things that make a difference to students. Giving teachers time for innovation. That's hard, because often we don't give them the time. And then supporting risk-taking. Every principal I've ever met says they support risk-taking, but not really. Yeah, take a risk, but don't screw up. So I have 3 concrete suggestions for creating a slightly more risk-taking culture. First, normalize it by having the most experienced, most widely respected teachers talk about the risks they've taken where things haven't paid off. Just normalizing that idea of risk-taking. Secondly, share the risk. I'm not a big fan of team teaching. Most of the time it's 2 teachers doing the work of 1. But for innovation, I think it's valuable, because then if it goes wrong, each can blame the other for its failure. But the most important thing to do for risk-taking is don't praise people when the risk pays off, because then you're just saying play safe. Praise them before they've taken the risk, when nobody knows whether it's going to work. That A, stops them from taking stupid risks. You could actually then say, no, that's too stupid idea. And B, it creates a genuine risk-taking culture. I have no idea whether that's going to work or not, but it sounds like it's worth a gamble. Go for it. And we think that actually can be quite effective. So there's a case study in risk you can read up afterwards if you're interested in. But just want to share with you the power of this kind of thing. This comes from Matthew Kraft, I mentioned earlier. John Pape and Matthew Kraft looked at teacher growth in weak, average, and strong professional learning environments. So they've got this quite nice way of classifying a learning environment about whether teachers are supported in their learning, whether there's a culture of improvement. And so that's how much better teachers get in terms of standard deviations. I want to just focus on how long does it take a teacher to get to a 0.1 student standard deviation improvement. It's like a 25% increase in productivity, that line there. So here's what's interesting. In the strong professional learning environment, they'll get there in 4 years. In the average professional learning environment, they'll get there in 7 or 8 years. In the weak professional learning environment, they will never get there. So actually, the general professional environment of the school has a huge impact on how quickly teachers improve and how much they improve. So that's what we think is best done in these things that we call teacher learning communities. I want to be clear. People hear that and they think it's a teaching and learning community. It's not. So, English has this real problem with teaching and learning. Welsh, Maori, doesn't have that problem. We use the same word for both. Causes no confusion. Well, actually, in Welsh now we have a separate word for teaching and learning because education experts invented one. It's just English used to be like that too. Lernen, the Scandinavian, the Norse word, used to mean both learning and teaching. But then in the 16th century, this word tekken, same root as token, which meant to show or to present, gained hold. So now we have teaching and we have learning. And schools used to have teaching and learning policies, and they've changed them to learning and teaching policies, and they're feeling pretty pleased with themselves, I can tell you. Because they've said that learning is more important than teaching. Well, of course it is, but one is how you achieve the other. It's like saying that traveling is more important than driving, or driving is more important. It's meaningless. Here's the point. You can't have a learning policy. Learning is this mysterious process that happens inside students' heads. You can have a teaching policy. This is what we're going to do. So I think we need to re-embrace this word teaching as being, this is what we're going to do. We hope that it's going to result in learning, but we're also aware of how hard it is to control that learning process. So a teacher learning community is a kind of professional learning community where full membership is restricted to people who are still teaching. Because I think as soon as you stop teaching full-time, you have credibility as a practitioner for about 6 weeks. And then you just forget how bloody hard teaching is. Because when you stop teaching full-time, your world changes in all kinds of ways, like you choose when to go to the toilet. Teachers don't. It's that, I mean, basically, teaching is production line work for intellectuals. It's just incredible. It's like being on a production line. You have no control over your stressors. And so basically, I suggest that leaders don't attend these meetings unless they are there as teachers, and you keep your mouth shut. And it's really hard for leaders. But, you know, people used to say, when I was a pro-vice chancellor, briefly, I ran a university, people said I was scary. I said, no, I'm not scary. I'm cuddly. I'm nice. But of course, how I see myself doesn't matter. It's how they see me. And if you're a boss, you're going to be a boss in any meeting that you attend. And you'll change the conversation. So just accept that. And you'd love to be there, but it's just really hard. So here's what we learned. This slide is kind of embarrassing because it took us 2 years. We started out, we did everything wrong. We thought it would take a year. It takes 2 years to bed this in. We started with 3s and 4s, based on critical friendship groups, coaching triads, and it's too small to have good discussions. Actually, we found that 10 to 12 is the optimum size, and 14 is better than 8. We started with all the maths teachers in one group, all the history teachers in a different group, in primary, all the early years teachers in one group, all the upper juniors in the other group. Bad idea. Because when you're talking about pedagogy, any teacher can learn something from any other teacher. And it stops the conversation degrading into something that isn't just about pedagogy. So we actually think mixed subjects are good. There's a problem if you only have one maths teacher in a group, because they'll say things like, this won't work in maths. If they're the only maths teacher in the group, they'll get away with it. That said, I actually think this won't work is a really positive sign. It's a sign of engagement. If they're saying this won't work, they've thought about making it work. It's much better than whatever. I saw this off in the 1980s. Pretty sure I can see it off again. This too shall pass. So basically, find out why they think it won't work. Let me give you a concrete example. We talked about comment-only marking rather than giving grades or scores. Maths teachers said you can't do that in maths. If you tick 15 of these equations as correct and put a cross next to 5 others, the students can figure out for themselves. They got 15 out of 20, whether you tell them or not. So we suggested maybe things like 5 of these are wrong, you find them, you fix them. But I want to point out, it was the resistance of maths teachers that made us think about this more deeply, because they were right. Comment-only marking doesn't work. Comment-only marking is just one way of actually making feedback into a kind of detective process, rather than just information. So basically, if people are saying this won't work, ask them why. You might learn something. But the hybrid approach means you've got 2 maths teachers, 2 science teachers, maybe 2 history teachers, so there can be some cross-challenge. We started out with meetings every 2 weeks. And it was too frequent. People said to us, 2 weeks to try out one new idea? What is it with these teachers? But if you've never been a teacher, you don't realize how delicate and fragile a teacher's working life is. And once you climb back aboard that roller coaster at the beginning of a new term, just staying aboard is hard enough. Changing what you're doing while you're doing it is hard. It's what that teacher called in-flight engine repair. So we discovered that 4 weeks are needed for any teacher to try out, to plan, to think through, and try out any new idea. So monthly meetings, and then time between meetings for collaborative planning or peer observation. And then the other thing is, if you're a leader, think about any necessary waivers from school policies. So for example, if you've got a policy that says that kids must get a grade every week, and teachers want to try out alternating summative and formative assignments, for example, be aware they might need a waiver from that policy, but then make them a report back to see whether you want to change the school's policy. So the other thing that we pretty quickly evolved was this idea of a signature pedagogy. We got this from Lee Schulman. He pointed out that If you go to law school anywhere in North America, it'll look pretty much the same. I don't remember that paper chase program from the 1980s with John Houseman as the crusty old law professor. But basically, any law school in America looks like that. Anywhere people are studying to be doctors, they'll do these things called ward rounds. Can you imagine the students saying to the doctor, "What are we doing tomorrow?" "Rounds." "Oh, we did rounds today. Can't we do something different tomorrow?" "No. Rounds tomorrow, rounds the day after that." What Lee Shulman points out is that the professions have these signature pedagogies, which are not perfect, but they're good enough. They're good enough to create a structure for the professional learning so that the structure falls into the background and the learning comes into the foreground. So after a few years of experimentation, we came up with this structure. Activity 1, introduction to the meeting. Activity 2, some kind of starter activity. Activity 3, feedback. Every teacher gives feedback on what they promised to do at the previous meeting and gets support from colleagues. Activity 4 is a drip feed about new learning about formative assessment. So Etienne Wenger, the man who, along with Jean Lave, invented the term communities of practice, has pointed out that to be sustainable, they need to combine familiarity and novelty. So you have things that are the same and things that are different. Activity 5 is always personal action planning. Teachers getting 15 minutes once a month to think about how will I be a better teacher next month than I was this month. Most teachers never get 15 minutes to think. If you're at home, your family's making demands. If you're at school, there's always a colleague or a student who wants your time. Carving out 15 minutes once a month, each teacher to reflect on how will I be better next month. And then activity 6 is the review of learning. Did we achieve our aims? If yes, great. If no, what should we do about it? So, oops, let me skip over this one here. So obviously these groups need leaders. People ask us, how should we train these leaders? My advice, don't. When people running these groups think they're experts on formative assessment or any other kind of habit change, they end up telling other people what to do. We've seen teachers in their second year of teaching being outstanding leaders of these groups because they know they don't have the answers. Somebody once joked that this is more like Alcoholics Anonymous and other models of professional development, because there aren't any experts in this group. There are people getting together with like-minded colleagues for mutual support. So the leader does need to get the resources there, does need to keep the agenda on track to maintain a collegial and supportive environment, but most importantly, not to be the formative assessment expert. There's some more slides in there that you might want to look at about how you might support the leaders. So just to cut the chase, my advice is that school principals, vice principals should meet monthly with the leaders of these TLCs. So just to tie this up, the principal, say, is the leader of a PLC of TLC leaders. But the idea is that you are there. I mean, basically, if you get the leaders together, you'll find out what's going on. You'll be kept in touch with what's going on, but you won't be physically in those meetings and changing the mood and the environment. The idea is that you support the leaders of those TLCs by meeting with them separately. And then peer observation. This term is used a lot. Often it's used to describe a process that I would call bosses checking up on subordinates. That's performance management. It's a good thing. It needs to happen. My experience doesn't change very much, because when people think they're being observed, they put on a show. I was in a school a while back, and the principal, they were having a school inspection, so the principal thought it'd be a good idea for teachers to get used to having people in their classrooms, observing them, giving feedback. So I agreed to help out. I watched this lesson. It was a geography lesson. It was quite good. I asked the students, what do you think of that lesson? And one boy said to me, it was good. It was better last week. Knowing he was being observed by somebody from outside, the teacher had chosen to teach exactly the same lesson a second time to the same students. That's what happens when people think they're being surveilled and checked up on. So I think performance management needs to happen, but below the radar we need a separate process, which I call peer observation, based on genuine peers. So, if Kevin's come into my classroom to observe me, I tell him, I'm trying to improve my wait time. Here's a stopwatch. Measure my wait times for me. Oh, and by the way, any notes you make in my classroom belong to me, because you're working for me. And when I'm in your classroom, any notes I make belong to you. Karl Popper once described his own schooling as a series of unwanted answers to unasked questions. And I think most teacher feedback looks a bit like that. There's a stranger coming into your classroom and telling you what they think you should be doing in your classroom. And it's just unhelpful. It's just not, I didn't ask for this. So if you want to improve classroom practice, have genuine peer observation where the person being observed owns the process, specifies the data to be collected, and owns any notes that have been made in the process. So I'm going to skip one more thing. I'll do want a little bit of time for questions. So how will we know it's working? The most crucial thing is teachers are given time to meet. In one study, teachers promised 75 minutes once a month to every teacher. Only 25% of the scheduled meetings took place. I showed the data to the principals. They said, I said, I thought you said this was a priority. They said it is. Yeah, but I thought you said it was a number one priority. They said it is. I said, how many other number one priorities do you have? They said lots. So the hardest thing is getting teachers time to think, which is why I started off today with making room for impact. Teachers act as critical friends. To begin with, when teachers are sharing experiences, there's a lot of, oh, that's nice, next. And over time, we see the trust building and people pushing back and say, I don't see what's formative about that. You'll see the prevalence of desired practices increasing. Students report being more engaged in classrooms. I talked about the importance of comment-only marking. Charlotte Kerrigan, an English teacher, was dissatisfied with the amount of attention her students were giving to her comments. So she wrote her comments on strips of paper. And each group of 4 students got back their 4 essays and their 4 strips of paper, and their task was match the comments to the essays. That tells me she gets it. The way that teachers modify these techniques tells you whether they're understanding the basic ideas behind them, telling them whether thinking is evolving. So that's, teachers modify the techniques in a deep way. And then finally, there's a shift in the ownership of the reform. So my partner and I, Siobhan Leahy, have prepared 2 years' worth of materials. You can buy them from Hawker Brownlow if you're interested. You can make up your own. The slides that you'll get from my website will be enough. People ask us, when is year 3 coming out? Year 3 is never coming out. Because if you've done years 1 and 2 properly, you'll be ready to write year 3 yourself. The big idea is that signature pedagogy will never change. What changes is activity 4, the new learning about formative assessment. You can bring in videos of practice. You can have specialist groups. Formative assessment and gifted students, formative assessment and special needs, formative assessment and IT. But the idea is that teachers constantly promise to their colleagues, here's one we're going to work on for the next month, get feedback from their colleagues, are held accountable. That seems to me to be the most powerful way forward. And from a randomized controlled trial with 160 high schools, half of them given resources for doing formative assessment, half of them given extra cash and left alone for 2 years, we know that teachers given time to work on formative assessment get better. And here's the big takeaway. Over years 9 and 10 in Australian terms, the teachers doing formative assessment got 25% more progress from their kids in national examinations at a cost of about $2 per student per year by changing how teachers spent 1% of their time. There is nothing that we know of that comes even close to that right now. The big idea here is making teaching more responsive to student needs. One chemistry teacher in Southeast London, I think mentioned already today, she said it's basically about making the students' voices louder and making the teachers' hearing better. It's about making teaching more engaging and responsive to student needs. That has unlimited potential for improving practice. So we have a couple of minutes left, I think, or maybe just a minute, so we have just maybe one question. And I'm very happy to stay behind and answer any questions individually. But does anybody have any burning questions about this? You'll get the slides. Anything else you want to know? Yeah. Should we get the microphone? Because they won't be hearing you at the back.
You talked about the structure of the actual learning sessions, or when the teachers get together. And within that, there was time for instruction, I suppose, around the thing that you're focused on. So if teachers are owning their own thing, for example, wait time, should that information session be around that, or do they
No.
choose what it's about?
So basically, these things work best when every teacher in the group is working on something different. That's the choice part. Each teacher chooses what they want to work on. So every meeting, there's some new information just to kind of drip feed in new ideas. But you're not expected to use any of these unless they fit in with your practice. The idea is that session 4 is there to create novelty and freshness and create something novel. But if you want to work on wait time for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, that's okay. Basically, it takes about 3 months to change your wait time. Once you've got that, you will never go back, because you'll just feel horrified at how little time kids have to think in classrooms. Basically, it's about changing those habits. I've lost track of the number of times I've described a formative assessment technique to a group of teachers, and somebody says to me, "Oh yeah, I used to do that. It was good. I used to do that, it was good, but something else came along and I don't do it anymore." Our change is not cumulative because we're not giving teachers time to embed these things into practice before we move them on to something else. If we want sustainable, cumulative change, we have to go more slowly. That's the important idea.
Dylan, thank you. The fact that you've been able to hold an audience this size from 3:30 to 5 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, I think illustrates just the wisdom of what you've shared with us today. And I think each one of us is sitting here with so many things running through our heads and so many things of, yeah, I used to do that. Why did I change? So, colleagues, could you please join with me in thanking Professor Dylan Miller. We do have chat with the sponsors outside now, if you so wish, and cocktail reception starting at 5:30. So we'd love to see many of you there. Thank you.